If you only watch the news, you think Toronto is falling apart. You think crime is exploding. You think that it's dangerous to take transit and the city isn't what it used to be. But what does the actual data say? Is Toronto becoming unsafe, or are we just reacting to headlines and anecdotes? In this video, I'm going to break down a number of things. We're going to talk about the 10-year crime trends. We're going to talk about where crime actually happens, how Toronto compares nationally and globally, and whether the media narrative matches reality. Because if you're thinking about moving here or within the city, safety is important and it deserves more than just a thumbnail headline. So before we get into facts and figures and data and stuff like that, I just wanted to give my perspective. I live in the city. My family and I live in the city. We're in Midtown. We live in Davisville. I've been in Toronto since 2015. First moved to Yonge and Eglinton with my then girlfriend, now wife. My wife is born and raised in the city. We have two young kids, two boys, 4 and 6 years old. Toronto feels very safe to us. Now, for sure, we live in probably what is one of the more, statistically, one of the more safer neighborhoods in the city. We're staying relatively close to home, primarily because, our little guys, it's not as easy to kind of travel and get all over the city and explore the entire city. But like I said, just wanted to provide that perspective about how it feels to me, how it felt to me prior to having kids, and just kind of being a younger person in 2015, 2016, kind of walking around, coming home late from a bar or something like that, to transitioning to, having a younger family. Toronto, generally speaking, feels very safe for me. Now, let's zoom out first. One of the biggest mistakes people make is reacting to what happens in a single year. Crime doesn't necessarily move in a straight line. It will spike, it will fall, it will kind of flatline or stabilize. So let's take a look at what the long-term patterns have. We'll start with homicides. That's probably the scary one. It might be the one that kind of makes people feel either the most or least safe, is kind of hearing about murders for the most part. So here is a chart showing homicide rates and shooting incidents in the city. And so as you can see, we certainly saw a peak of homicides in 2024 of 86, up from 58 in 2014, slightly up from 2019 of 80. Now, projections of what data is going to be coming out for 2025 so far is showing a big decline from 86 down to 39, but we'll wait for those official stats to come out. When you look at shooting incidents, it's very volatile, right? We went from 177 in 2014 all the way up to a peak of 495 in 2019, declined down to 2024. And again, the projections for 2025 are going to be not quite half, but significantly less than the 2024 numbers. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is this data that you're looking at is from Toronto Police Services. This encompasses the city of Toronto. There's some data that I'm going to show a little bit later on this video that is from Statistics Canada, and that is based on what's called Toronto's census metropolitan area. So that's a much larger area and a much larger population. So if you see some discrepancies on a per whatever rate or just a total number, that would be why. So in 2024, with that number of 86 homicides, that's roughly 2.6 per 100,000 residents. So that's not zero, but it's very firmly in single digits, and it's relatively low, and it's nowhere near a lot of major US cities. And Toronto has been labeled, both statistically and for other reasons as well, the safest city in the Americas. And it's largely because of that very low homicide rate. It's probably about half of that of New York, just to kind of give you some data. We're going to look at major US cities and international cities in a little bit later on this video as well. Number of shootings do tend to fluctuate from year to year, which is what we talked about. 2024 was higher than 2023 in the Toronto Open data set, but still within the range that we've seen from like the mid 2010s. So the honest summary, Toronto is not experiencing runaway violent crime growth. There was a post-pandemic bump, I think that's happened in many cities, but there hasn't been an exponential or exceptional upward trend that has remained consistent. Now, if we shift to property crime, this is where we certainly have seen a bigger shift happen. So here is a chart showing major crimes data, and we can see that auto theft, for example, right here, is up big time. It's up 141% since 2015. So that's definitely the defining kind of property crime story of the last 10 years. Assaults are up 23% right here, and there's been a trend from 2014 to 2019 to 2020. Or again, the projection for 2025 is a decline, which is great. Where we've seen declines is in breaking and entering and in robberies. And that's good to see, because the thing you want to bear in mind is that these numbers are total incidences. They aren't on a per capita basis. Despite maybe what you've seen or heard in headlines, Toronto's population has grown, and has grown fairly consistently over the past number of years as well. While I didn't have access to the per capita rates of these things, it's not terribly shocking that total numbers are up when the population has been growing, and growing at a pretty steady and pretty decent rate. So when people say crime is out of control, that's not accurate across all categories. What is accurate is that specific crimes, especially auto theft, have surged and others have declined, and it's very different from like a city-wide collapse. I mentioned before per capita versus kind of raw numbers. This is important. Toronto's population has grown. It doesn't automatically mean that risk per person has risen, and so I do have some per capita rates. It's just not those major crimes per capita rates. But here's what I have to share with you. This chart is the Crime Severity Index for 2024, so CSI, and the Violent Crime Severity Index for 2024. And it compares major census metropolitan areas across Canada. What we have is the blue line is the CSI, and then the red line is the Violent CSI. And you can see Toronto, way down here, had a CSI of 59.4 and a Violent CSI of 78.2. That only is beaten by Ottawa. So when you compare it to Montreal, Vancouver, Edmonton, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, it is significantly lower. The Canadian overall average was 77.9. So that means that Toronto is not only below these other kind of major metropolitan areas, but it's below the national average in crime severity, period. That's not opinion. Those are stats from Statistics Canada. That report also goes on to show that 63% of major crimes occurred in the top 20 kind of neighborhoods where the most number of major crimes are happening. And bear in mind that the City of Toronto has split the city up into 158 different neighborhoods. So 63% happens in the top 20 out of 158 neighborhoods. That is extreme concentration. It means that most neighborhoods experience relatively low incident levels, while a small number of areas in the city account for a much larger share. Now, what about downtown versus outer areas? This isn't necessarily like a safe versus an unsafe. It's actually different risk profiles. So downtown commercial and entertainment areas do tend to show higher assault volumes, higher theft tied to like foot traffic, whereas lower density neighborhoods tend to show higher auto theft rates. And, I can attest to just anecdotally seeing a lot of stuff over the past couple of years in either my neighborhood or kind of surrounding neighborhoods where there's a lot of people who own cars and drive, but don't have garages with garage doors. There's a lot of like open driveways, carports, front pad parking, and tons of people just messaging, hey, my car was stolen. If you happen to see this car around, or if you have a connection, with the city police, something like that. If you had it happen to you and you have anything to pass along, please share, because we're going through this right now. Auto theft has been shown to have a strong negative association with density. So that means that it's often worse in lower density areas because of driveways and also highway access. So someone who's moving to, say, Midtown versus like a slightly suburban pocket will experience different risk categories. And that doesn't mean that the city is broadly unsafe. It just means that crime follows certain opportunity patterns. Let's talk about transit. This was just one article, but there's been many. This article in particular was titled "Rising Crime on Public Transit is Creeping Closer to Campuses." So that headline feels alarming. It's an article that was written by what's called The Varsity, which is a University of Toronto publication. I think it's kind of student-led and student-written. But what's interesting is that inside the article, it acknowledges that transit crime declined from 2023 to 2024, despite the title saying that rising transit crime. Now, that's just 1 year. And I said earlier in the video, hey, crime is not just 1 year, but other sources online have indicated that transit crime also declined from 2024 to 2025, and that article left that information out as well. This article, by the way, was written in early 2026, so it's had access to that, but it kind of, I felt like, conveniently maybe left that out. This is a perfect example of perception versus trend. Is there crime on transit? Yes, there is. Is it rising structurally? The data doesn't suggest that, and over the past couple of years, it's been declining. Rare but highly disturbing events have been occurring over the past few years, and reports show that many of these incidents are random in nature, and that would inherently make anyone, including myself, feel less safe, because it's very easy to say that could happen to me. It's not targeted, it's happening to random people. But regardless, headlines and social media will amplify tension, and data often tells a little bit more of a calmer story. I do want to be clear, serious violent incidences are newsworthy. They're emotionally powerful, but statistically, they're rare. Research consistently shows media coverage overrepresents unusual violent events compared to base rates. That probably isn't shocking to anyone. If it bleeds, it leads. We're all kind of naturally wired to pay attention to things that will be scary. So what dominates either your news feed or your social media? It's going to be things like shootings, random assaults, transit incidences, and what is it that doesn't trend? Per capita declines, long-term robbery reductions, geographic concentration analysis, those types of things, because they're kind of boring, not that sexy, right? When people say it feels like crime is everywhere, the data shows something narrower. Crime is concentrated, specific categories surged, but the citywide risk profile remains relatively and comparatively moderate. That's not minimizing, it's just adding some context. So let's zoom out a little further, because safe only makes sense kind of relative to something. Just showing this chart quickly again with crime severity indexes and the violent crime severity indexes. Toronto is much, much lower than other major metropolitan areas in Canada, and it really only gets ranked by Ottawa. Then there's this chart. These are some Canadian cities as well as a few international cities, and it shows homicide rates. And you can see, by the way, these are rates per 100,000 in capita. So you can see across the bottom, you've got London in the UK, there's Toronto at 1.9, Vancouver, Montreal, Edmonton, Winnipeg, there's New York, there's LA, there's Chicago. Now, what's interesting is I had to put Australia. They don't necessarily have citywide data. They had more national data. It was much harder to find numbers, but Australia is showing some very low numbers as well. So Toronto is much closer to London or major cities in Australia than it is to New York, and certainly places like Chicago. That doesn't mean no crime. It just means the scale is very different. So if you are moving here from a major US city, Toronto's homicide risk is significantly lower. So while we're talking about major US cities, here's a bar chart showing a bunch of kind of major metro areas. This data comes from the FBI. So here's New York, the orange one. There's LA. Those are the two that I've mentioned so far in this video before. Here is Houston. Here's Philly. Here's Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Baltimore, Memphis, St. Louis, and Birmingham, Alabama. And the numbers can get quite big. And then lastly, comparing Toronto to other major cities just within Canada probably provides a little bit more of a better context. It's one thing to show the crime severity indexes and the violent crime severity indexes, but again, just what about homicide rates, which is kind of that one, again, that people probably feel most or least safe about. Here is Toronto. Here on the far left, you've got Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, Winnipeg, and Saskatoon. Now, what these numbers are, the blue line is the 2024 rate, the red line is 2023, and then the yellow line for all of them is the average rate over the past decade, 2014 to 2023. You can see that up there in the title. There's no question Toronto is higher on average than the previous 10 years. So, you absolutely could say, well, on a homicide kind of basis, Toronto is becoming a little less safe. I think that's why programs like SafeTO are being implemented. There are different kind of community programs that are being kind of initiated and brought in to make sure that that number stays, relatively low and more in line with what the average has been over the last 10 years. But you can see that for other cities in Canada, the trend has been similar. So Toronto is not alone in that 2024 is either higher than 2023 or higher than the average. It's not always the case. You look at Vancouver, Vancouver's seen a big decline over the past while, which is fantastic. But you can see Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Ottawa is significantly higher at 2.1 compared to, their 10-year average of 1.3. Now, these numbers, you're probably noticing, if you remember that I mentioned before, these numbers are based on census metropolitan areas, not the City of Toronto, Toronto Police Services data. So that's why you're seeing 1.9 instead of the 2.6 that I mentioned for Toronto earlier in the video. So is Toronto safe? Compared to other large North American cities, yes. Statistically, it ranks very low in severity. Toronto also ranked the second safest city in the world in a 2021 report by The Economist. And, that's 2021. That was almost 5 years ago now. But Toronto has consistently ranked in the top 10 safest cities in the world over the past 2 decades. Now, is Toronto crime-free? No. What's rising? Auto theft, some assault metrics, but there are things that are declining. Robbery, breaking and entering. Transit incidences recently, over the past couple of years. Is crime evenly distributed? Absolutely not. It's concentrated in specific neighborhoods and specific types of places. And that's the key takeaway, I think, for anyone who's moving here. Safety in Toronto is hyperlocal. You don't evaluate Toronto, you evaluate certain neighborhoods in Toronto. You evaluate risk categories, you evaluate context. So the media narrative often paints with a very broad brush, but the data points often to something else. If you're moving to Toronto and safety is one of your biggest concerns, the right question isn't necessarily, is Toronto safe? It's what's happening in the specific neighborhood that I'm considering, because averages don't necessarily help you choose where to live. If you'd like to talk through specific areas, I'm always happy to have that conversation. Bear in mind that in the next video, I'm going to break down the safest neighborhoods in Toronto based on actual data. So if there's an area that you're curious about, please drop it in the comments below. I'm Jamie Harnish with Bosley Real Estate, and I'll see you on the next one.